The social impact sector has made community co-creation almost sacred. Design with people, not for them. Give everyone a voice. And I believe it, but I've also watched it go sideways. The meeting that devolves into NIMBYism, or the planning process that stalls because everybody gets a vote, but nobody makes a call. The loudest voices in the room are often not even the most informed ones, and sometimes a leader just has to make a decision. I've lived this running my own agency for 16 years. I still don't have a clean answer for where the line is between participation and just making progress. Taylor Stuckert has been on every side of this tension. He's the CEO of Lead for America, a national service organization. And before that, he spent 14 years as a planner in his hometown of Wilmington, Ohio, a place that lost almost 10,000 jobs overnight when DHL shut down. He watched that crisis get managed behind closed doors. He also sat through years of heated planning commission meetings where community input made things harder, not easier. And in our conversation, we dig into this question that nobody in our space really wants to ask out loud. Can too much community input actually be a problem? And what does it look like to lead with conviction while still making room for the voices of the people that you serve? I'm Eric Ressler, and this is Designing Tomorrow. And now my conversation with Taylor Stuckert. Taylor Stuckert, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you have a really interesting background, Peace Corps, coming back to rural Ohio where you grew up and seeing a really changed community. And I actually think I want to start there because you came back to a community that had gone through a pretty big shift. The main employer, which DHS, I believe, had gone through some big restructuring, and there was a lot of disruption in the economy. And my understanding from talking to you and learning about you is that there was this moment where big decisions that really had a major influence on the future of the city were being made essentially behind closed doors by senators, by corporate leaders. And you said, no, that's not how we're going to do this. And you kind of took matters into your own hands with a bit of a guerrilla movement building play that I'd love if you would share that part of your history with our listeners as a way to kick off our interview today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the company was DHL, it's an international shipping company. I think most people probably know about. And Wilmington's unique. It's a small town of about 12,000. And if you look at it on a satellite view on Google Maps, you'll see this large airport that physically is about the size of the community. It was an old strategic air command base from the 50s. It closed down in the 70s and then was acquired by a shipping company in the early 80s. Airborne Express grew that incrementally over many years. And then DHL, this massive, the largest shipping company in the world, acquired it as the headquarters for its domestic operations here in Wilmington, Ohio. And so growing up in the community, the airport always was sort of a backdrop in the community. It wasn't anything that I felt like stood out in the way that a lot of like physical large employers and sort of like industrial campuses stands out because it's an airport. What was unique, you would see a stream of planes flying in on the night sky every night growing up. But so it was always just kind of there in the background. You knew people that worked there. I had family that worked there. And it just wasn't anything, I think maybe because of its slow growth over many years, it wasn't anything that felt like this big splash and then something that just like disappeared. It was like slowly growing over many years and then it disappeared. And so it was kind of a unique situation in that regard. So, I had been in the Peace Corps and service was disrupted and ended up back home really just kind of by accident around that time. And, the national recession was starting. And I think because of the timing of the announcement, Wilmington was sort of thrusted into the national spotlight, as some people would say was the ground zero of the Great Recession at that time. And, I've talked to a lot of colleagues about this, especially in recent years, just because I think when we think of impactful issues facing communities. It's very natural today for us to think about community meetings, community conversations. Things like town halls are a very, relatable environment and things that people could see today. They could picture the viral videos of town halls. And I think that we take for granted how new of a concept that is. I think in like New England, they've always had town halls and sort of robust civic engagement. But I think for most of our communities, large economic decisions, industrial decisions, were not things that were a very democratic process that involved the broader community. However, when I was in the Peace Corps, that was something that we were sort of teaching in our work abroad, was the importance of community engagement, of people having a seat at the table and sort of drawing out the vision for the future of the community. And so when I came back home, this big event was happening, and for that conversation to not be happening felt a little odd. And again, it wasn't. I don't think it was unusual in sort of the high level view. I think that was actually probably the norm. But it was unusual looking at it through the lens of work we had done through like international development. Um, and so, yeah, a friend of mine from growing up here in Wilmington and I happened to be home at the same time. And we felt that it would make sense because this was such a profound change for the community. It would make sense for the community to have some voice in sort of that envisioning process for the future. And so, we didn't really have a strong vision for what that should be. It was really about, galvanizing a community conversation. And so, yeah, we took kind of, you might call like guerrilla tactics, just by, identifying certain popular community gathering spaces or moments to start to initiate that conversation. So we have this holiday parade that takes place every year, the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Thousands of people are in our downtown. And we printed out probably 1,000 or more of these little flyers that just said, are you mad about the DHL situation? Come to this meeting to talk about the future. And we handed them all out. And, we didn't really have too much of a plan for what that conversation would look like. And we certainly didn't anticipate what ultimately transpired, which was, a few hundred people showing up to a meeting. We had several regional news stations that even came. And, so we had to like kind of throw this conversation together. And, for us at the time, it really was about, Wilmington's going through this major economic transition. Where do we see ourselves from an employment standpoint, from a workforce development standpoint, from a community standpoint? Where do we see ourselves in this future economy? And it's interesting, to look back to 2009. Again, hindsight's always 2020. To think about how, in that moment, even then, there was a lot of question about what the future of work looked like. What will transpire coming out of the recession? And it feels, eerily similar to where we are today as we think about technological disruption, how jobs are going to be impacted by these disruptions, and what are the future skills needed? What are the future job opportunities? What do wages look like? These were a lot of the same questions that we were having and talking about in 2009 as well.
There's a lot of good threads I want to pull on there, and we're going to get to your current role as the CEO of Lead for America and talk a little bit more about what you're going through right now that I think will relate back to this. But I actually want to hold on something that I struggle with a lot personally, trying to form a strong opinion about, and that is about community input, community co-creation. Because I think there is this lionization of that approach in the social impact space. And I think it's rooted in good reasoning. And I also think that there are some negative downsides that can happen when the process gets almost too democratic, to put it in a weird way. The way that I think about this showing up is in these, these city council meetings, these community convening meetings where there are, residents who have a stake in the game, who have really strongly held opinions, but maybe don't see the full picture or have very personal motivations for their opinions. And then I see process for social change get bogged down. And I'm curious about like what is the best version of that and what is the worst version of that? So like one maybe practical example we could talk about is like housing supply, right? Where there is in California where I am a very strong at this point state mandate where like our cities in California and our counties in California actually have much less power than they used to around decisions around housing. And yet, like housing creation is still a major issue, and there are very strong counterpoints to like some of this housing supply creation. And some of the criticisms I think are fair, but other times it's really just straight NIMBYism. And so like community co-creation, community input is a double-edged sword in certain ways. And I'd love you, I think, are uniquely qualified to have a strong opinion about this because of your background and your work you do every day. How do you think about that tension?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like I've lived it, from every angle of perspective around it, from NIMBYism to now YIMBYism, and I heard a recent one, a new acronym recently called BANANA, which was build absolutely nothing build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, something like
I've
that.
heard that one. Yeah.
Yeah, which is often what it feels like. I mean, I was a regional planning director before this, right? Like I was in the front lines of that. I've been through numerous heated city council meetings, heated planning commission meetings about everything from like very impactful things based on scale to things that it's really surprising that we're having a heated debate about this. From the smallest of items like a fence to a full, housing development. So I definitely hear you on the sort of like upside and downside of that. I think I felt like I had really, you know, developed my thinking on it throughout my time in planning, and really centered it on the belief that you have to invest as much time, energy, and resources in the actual sort of preparatory, like engagement, community engagement aspect to the work as you do around the issue itself. I mean, proactiveness is everything, right? And
Mhm.
yet planning feels so reactive. Community development work often feels so reactive. All the tensions that we're talking about are reactions to an announcement, to a prospective development, and we're not doing that sort of like civic infrastructure work that's needed to be in place before those sort of those big announcements happen. And I think that's the problem, is we're always a step behind. I remember, we did a big comprehensive plan. It was one of the last major projects that I did in the community, and it keeps getting sort of referenced by both sides in like tense arguments these days. Um, and one thing I really set out to do for that process was to build a steering committee for it that that involved mostly people who I'd never met before. I mean, Clinton County, Ohio is a small county of 42,000 people. It's amazing when you have tens of thousands of people how easily it can be to think that you know everyone when really you
Yeah.
probably know less than 5% of the population, And so I was very intentional about that steering committee and identifying people who did not hold elected office, who were not sort of the typical well-known people that you see in community meetings or at the front of city council conversations, and bringing them to the table. A lot of them, not a majority or anything, but several of them were people who had just moved to the community. And often that's a tension point. It's like, I've been here my whole life, or you just moved here. What do you know? Um, and I think that, it was a fascinating process. And I wouldn't say it was perfect by any means, but it was really interesting to me how that shifted the dynamic of that process, of the conversation, and then ultimately of the adoption of the plan. It actually felt like something that people saw themselves in, that they heard their voice in. And to your point about the upside and the downside, we have to get away from this notion that we're going to make perfect decisions. And I think everyone always says that, right? Like we know you're not going to please everyone. That's like such a cliche, but yet we still struggle with that notion that you're just not going to please everyone. But that shouldn't take away for how we engage everyone, or we at least create opportunities for everyone to be involved in the process.
Yeah, I think I appreciate your commentary on that, and I actually think there's a similar issue that I struggle with, even leading a small social impact agency, and I can imagine this problem only scales as you grow, and you're leading a much bigger team than I am. Where similarly, like you want to co-create with your team, right? You want to empower your team. You want your team to have ideas and bring them in good spirit and have decision making, not just be totally hierarchical and top down. And yet, I think similarly, there's a time and a place for leadership, right? For people who are in positions of leadership to make strong choices, even if some people disagree with those choices. And I see this as like a similar metaphor to like co-creating with the community. There's a similar scope and scale where you're co-creating within an organization that I think a lot of executive directors and CEOs are kind of grappling with. To me, it feels like a different flavor of the same tension and the same balance that needs to be reached at some level. And honestly, that's something that I continue to struggle with as a leader. And I've been running Cosmic for 16 years at this point, and I've tried more democratic, less democratic processes in that, flatter structures, more opinionated leadership, and I still don't think I've found the like golden solution to that. It's something that I feel like is always a little bit fluid. Maybe depending on like the season that we're in as an organization. Are we in a growth mode? Are we in a consolidation mode? Like where are we at in the process? So I'd be curious to hear, like, does that parallel resonate with you from a leadership standpoint? Like, how do you think about that as you're running your organization as a CEO?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to touch on too, the head of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, Dame Louise Richardson, has, a brilliant person. A lot of her background was focused around domestic terrorism in Ireland. She's from Ireland, and she talks a lot about sort of the influence and the impact of binary framing in society as it relates to acts of aggression and violence. And I think that, going back to sort of the community voice piece of it and thinking about it even from an organizational standpoint, I think that, we have, through a variety of ways and factors, have put ourselves in this position where everything is a binary choice, right? And when we think of like, even does the community have a voice? Have they participated? It's not a binary situation, right? It's not yes or no. And one of the things I think about a lot lately, as you were talking about that being sort of lionized in the social impact sector, is that often surfaces, and yet we never really question, what does it even mean? Was the community involved, or did they have a voice? Did we engage who is the community? And we
Yeah.
act as if the community is this unified, object that has complete consensus, and you're either engaging them or you're not. And that's just so inaccurate to reality. And I think that leadership is really that responsibility of, hearing and listening and sort of analyzing the landscape, and hearing the multitude of voices of the community, recognizing that there's a pluralism in community, and bearing the responsibility of making challenging decisions based on the data and the observations and the information that they're seeing in these situations. And so, and that's why I sometimes I don't even like the notion of like, we're not going to please everyone, like as if pleasing is the basis of like all decision making or tough decision making.
Right.
And
Right.
then again, we put ourselves in these binary corners of like, you either pleased or you're displeased. And that's just not often how it shakes out. So, I think that when I talk to, people who are like coming up in their career all the time, I will say that I was sort of thrust into a leadership role. I found myself leading a regional planning agency without a ton of like serious management experience. And then, I've continued to stay in sort of a management or executive type position since that time. That I remember one of the things that I realized when I stepped into that role was how much I gave up in terms of like the hands-on work that I was doing. I no longer was able to do sort of the map making or the design work that I really enjoy doing. Now I was doing budgeting and making
Yeah.
management decisions and doing HR type stuff, like things I never imagined were a part of the equation. But we are sort of I think trained to see all careers as a ladder that lead to an executive role. I've accepted that I've been in that role now for long enough that I've acquired a lot of the skill sets and the necessary lived experience to navigate it well. But I'm not sure if I would have followed that path again if I was given the choice, because I think what comes with it is that responsibility of imperfect decision making, and dealing with a pluralism of voices and data and information, and never feeling like you're really making a perfect decision. And I think for us, naturally, that can be a challenge, is that you want to feel this sort of sense of closure in decision making. And I don't, I think sometimes it can happen in certain moments when you have a certain level of consensus or a process that feels um, fulfilling or satisfying of all the voices involved. But it's maybe rarer than we think it is.
Yeah, I imagine that almost everyone listening to this show who's in any form of a leadership or management position can relate to that. And I think that that is a healthy challenge, right? And I completely relate to the like I never feel like I make a perfect decision, and even that framing is probably a little bit of a misnomer. And as I've been doing this work longer and learning from other leaders, I'm always so impressed and inspired by leaders who find a way to like sit in that discomfort and yet still have conviction and like move quickly, in not in a reckless way but in like a confident way, and accept that they're always going to be a student in life at some level. But that's a lot easier to say than to actually do, especially when like real people's lives and livelihoods are at stake, either just your employees or because of the type of work that we're doing, where the stakes are high at certain points, right? We're not talking about in this space like, are we going to cut 15% of our highly paid tech workers? Not to diminish, the livelihood impacts of that for the tech worker class, but we're talking about like, is this intervention going to, hit underserved communities harder than we anticipate, or actually backfire in a way that is exactly opposite to the stated mission of our organization? So the stakes are much higher, and often the resources to have the right evidence, the right tools at our disposal to make those decisions as best as we can might also not be ideal. And it's a really challenging situation. Hey friends, real quick before we continue today's episode. I'm Eric Ressler, founder and creative director at Cosmic. Cosmic is a creative agency purpose-built for nonprofits and mission-driven organizations. For the last 15 years, we've helped leaders like you nail your impact story and sharpen your strategy. But we're not here to just leave you with a fancy slide deck and a pat on the back. We roll up our sleeves and help you bring our ideas to life through campaigns, creative, and digital experiences. Our work together helps you earn trust, connect deeply with your supporters, and grow your fundraising and your impact. If you value the thinking we share here and want it applied to your biggest challenges, let's talk at designbycosmic.com. All right, back to today's conversation. I feel like I'd like to transition actually, and this is a good time into your experience coming in as the CEO of Lead for America, not being a founder for the organization, but inheriting a CEO role, which is another identity shift. And we're going to talk a little bit about identity and narrative today. So I'd love if you could just share kind of a little bit of background on how that happened and what that experience has been like, and how you have stepped into that role as a leader, inheriting an organization, and kind of like what that experience is like.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I have been a founder of a nonprofit. And so I
Yep.
feel like I can relate to sort of the identity attachment that comes with founding something, and I try to hold that carefully. I know firsthand what that attachment can feel like. And so I try to be very respectful and caring of the attachment the individuals that started this organization, that got it off the ground, that they hold for it. And I sort of carry that with me as I do my work. I make sure that I'm thinking about that, and I'm sort of being considerate of sort of being a steward of this mission,
Yeah,
and just stewarding it while I have it, that ultimately someone else will likely take it and leave their fingerprints on it as well. So I think having had that experience, I probably care for it a little more carefully than somebody that maybe hadn't founded something before. Um,
sure.
so I would say that my style, just about in anything, whether it's work or personal life, and something I've kind of like dialed in on over the years, is a listen first approach to just about everything I do. And I do try to ensure that I'm giving the appropriate amount of attention and thought and consideration to those that help construct things, those that feel a part of things. And that can be anything from the founders of the organization to the staff, past or present. And then for us in particular, as a service organization, we have a lot of individuals who have passed through in a fellowship role and are now alumni, and hearing their experience and understanding what this mission means to them, and holding that while also inviting them to be a part of the continued evolution of the mission. And so I took that very seriously, and I think that it felt right for me just because of that experience and that approach, to come into a role like this where, I'm not the founder of the organization. I don't have that specific niche story that was often told over and over again, as the impetus or the sort of the foundation for the existence of this mission. But I've also been able to care for that and continue to grow and evolve that mission, and make sure that, I mean, this goes back to the conversation about who is the community when we talk about engaging the community.
Yeah.
Is it a fixed group of people, or is it a dynamic group of people that changes over time? And my belief is that it's always dynamic, and that the people coming into the work at this moment do have agency and do have a say over what this mission means and how they're going to contribute to it. So it's kind of a balancing of a bit of like sort of holding on to the past in a respectful and caring and considerate way, not losing sight of what people put in terms of sweat equity and care into this mission, but being a good steward and doing that but also looking at current conditions and future horizons for where this work is going, and trying to steward the work in a direction that is sustainable, that is authentic, and is responsive to the world that we live in today.
When we were prepping for this interview, and a little bit of time's passed since we did that, you mentioned that you were in the process of going through a strategic narrative shift at Lead for America. Catch me up on where you're at there, and like what was the impetus for that? How do you think about that in terms of identity, community, all of the topics that we're discussing here, and in engaging your team in doing that?
So, again, and I think I'm very comfortable looking at the past and recognizing it as a moment in time. I think sometimes people get uncomfortable with a sense that, like, when we talk about the past and we make shifts or we recalibrate, that we're saying that what they did was wrong, and that's never how I see it. I see it as sort of a just a moment in time. And I think that when this organization was founded, it's an era that I can totally relate to because I was a part of that community. I was not involved in Lead for America, but it was an era in which a lot of books and research and articles were put out about the brain drain issue and about
Right,
the
right.
the loss of young people from the heartland. And that really was sort of like the origin impetus for this work. Was you had a group of college students or college age students who had been from smaller communities, all across the country, from Kansas to Oklahoma to Minnesota, Kentucky, And they were in college and they were looking at the landscape of fellowship opportunities, and they all were taking them to New York or DC or Silicon Valley, but there really weren't any opportunities through a fellowship in the heartland or in the small community. And so they wanted to change that. They wanted to create opportunities for that. And I thought that, it's very noble. Again, it's very relatable to me as somebody who moved to New York City and then came back to Ohio. But over time, as I spent a lot of time in Ohio and the Midwest, I really came to see that narrative as very just one piece of the story and a small piece. It's definitely not telling the whole story about these communities and the future of these places. I think returners are important. I think brain drain is something that communities should care about, just from the standpoint of, are we inviting the young people that we raise to stay here, or but
Yeah.
are we also giving them the opportunities to flourish and do the things that they want to do? But I feel like that narrative totally leaves out, I would say, the majority, obviously the majority of the population. Returners and brain drain makes up a small percentage of the human capital that makes a community thrive. And I noticed that in my own work before Lead for America, that we're talking about a very small subset of individuals. And so as I came into this organization, I was very interested in expanding the tent, not just for that conversation, but for national service as a field. National service is something that does skew young, 18 to 24. And I totally support a lot of the folks that are still adamant that, like, this is the springboard for young people, and I agree with that. But I also think that people spring at different times of life. Some people spring
Sure.
mid-career. They might spring into retirement. And I think that service should be an opportunity that truly is open for all. And I think for a lot of our communities, we need everyone we can get, and we should welcome anyone that wants to step forward. And so, I think for me, as I transitioned into this role, I was really interested in taking a step back and thinking about, where is our mission and narrative really centered? And
Mhm.
historically, the centering was on the individual service fellow that came through the program, their journey, what I was describing, the founders, that they got to do this fellowship, and where did it take them from here? And I really thought that that is just a piece of the story and not the beginning and the end. But that really, the centering should be on the places that we're serving in this work. What is happening to the communities that we're supporting and partnering with in this journey? And so that really was the main shift, was to focus, our work on activating local talent and building the leadership pipelines that communities need to realize their own unique visions. We're not going to tell a community what their vision should be. We're not going to describe or prescribe to them what talent looks like, that it's an 18 to 24-year-old that went to this very prestigious school. It could look very different in one community. And we're going to let communities really be, step in step on building what leadership pipelines look like to them. And so that was really, the main shift. And that's really, where we have sort of recentered our work, recalibrated our work. And so as we look ahead, we're taking a step back. We're leaning into this notion. I talk a lot about, one of the things I was pleased by when I came into sort of the national nonprofit world, was that the one of the universal consensus that I felt like I could see was, everybody would always nod their head when somebody would say something to the effect of, "You've seen one community, you've seen one community," right? Like, we all
Mm.
sort of agree that communities are these very distinct, individualized things that at certain level have similarities across the board, but we don't arrange social sector interventions and even philanthropy in many ways at a national level to be aligned to that. It works at the local
Mhm.
level, it works at the regional level, but at the national level, we really have a hard time doing that, about how we measure impact, how we tell that story, how we fund it.
Yeah.
And it is hard. It's more challenging, but that's really, I personally, and I think as an organization, we want to be in that sort of challenging space, because I think that's where the work happens. That's where innovation happens.
Yeah, tell me more about how you think about that with regards to like you guys are in local communities in the day-to-day work, and yet you are this kind of national organization. Is it chapter based? Is it cohort based? Is it place based? Like how do you get the best of both worlds? And we do work with orgs like this that have like, districts or chapters. But then there is this kind of parent umbrella organization that provides the infrastructure, the backbone, the cross learnings. Like what's your version of that at Lead for America?
Yeah, and I tend to look at it through my own lens as a local practitioner first, and for many years, about what was I missing in that regard.
Yeah.
I mean, I was the person on the ground. I knew the community well. I didn't need a national nonprofit to come in and say I should do this or that. And I think that what I was missing, and I think what LFA is focused on providing, was that I didn't have the bandwidth to provide the administrative infrastructure that was needed to provide a fellowship opportunity to one or two individuals. Like, that's a lot
Yeah.
to ask for. I wasn't going to apply for a federal grant so that I could have one or two fellows working in my regional planning agency. The other thing was, I was very fortunate, so it wasn't specifically for me, but I saw the benefit of it to have been a part of a national dialogue. I think because of the spotlighting around the DHL situation, I was very
Yeah.
privileged to be a part of national panels about the future of small towns and rural communities. And I took a lot from that. I loved being a part of those conversations and bringing that knowledge back to my community, bringing those connections back to my community and those resources back to my community. And so I feel like that's something that I feel any local practitioner should want, is to feel connected to the country at large and not feel that they're working by themselves at the local level with nobody to relate to. And so I think, providing that national cohort model gives our participants who do our fellowship, but also the host site communities that we work with, the opportunity to be a part of something beyond their community. And there's sort of these indirect, maybe even direct, I think, effects of that, which is that, you know, especially as somebody who, has worked in a rural part of the country, having exposure to other communities, to other practitioners, whether they're in other rural communities or non-rural communities, is such an eye opener and is such an important piece of knowledge to share with the community that you're working in. And I think so from a civic sort of bridging opportunity, I think that it's a great way to bring people together from across the country, doing similar work for places that they care about specifically.
We're in another moment right now that it at least feels like we're on the precipice of another major technological disruption that's going to have impacts to the workforce, to careers, to starting and raising families. And I'm speaking broadly about AI here, but I think other technologies as well. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future about what happens there. I think I don't think anyone knows exactly what's going to happen here. But what I would like to ask you is like, what is the sentiment within these communities, especially within young people, where one of the stories that we're hearing and maybe even starting to see come true is that quote unquote entry level positions are going to be some of the first to be most exposed and, most exposed to some of these new technological disruptions. You've led organizations and towns and communities through major change from an economic standpoint before. How do you think about those major disruptions and how to plan for them and how we can best support culture change at that scale?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think what pains me the most about it is that I'm not that old, but I feel like I keep living through these like these crazy moments where I keep
Yeah.
thinking to myself, like, when are we going to learn? Right? Like coming out of the recession. I mean, all the stuff I was saying about sort of the proactive civic infrastructure building that we need to do, I think would have really served us well in this moment. And unfortunately, we're just not there. Um, and so I wish that we were. And I think the thing that I've learned over the years is to know that we don't know, right? And to avoid some of these like binary, again, this binary framing that we go into, that either AI is all good or it's all bad. I really don't operate there. I think that there's a ton of positive opportunity, and I think there's a lot of things that communities should be thinking about, and should be thinking about how they're going to address it in their own unique way. Um, I think that, for me, I think there's still a lot of things that aren't settled on this conversation. And I felt that early on, last summer, last fall, as data centers were being built, that
Right.
I think that where the developments are happening are just so happen to be a lot of the places where the digital divide is at its greatest.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about places where um, big shifts are happening, big infrastructure being developed in communities where a lot of people still don't have access to a laptop. They still don't know what a keyboard and a mouse is. They've never done a telehealth appointment. And now they're hearing about this new disruptive thing that the rest of us are ready to move on to. And so a few things come to mind for me. One is, we're not going to do it in a help. We're not going to make this transition, or we're not going to make this this transformation is not going to happen in a healthy way if we don't have this human infrastructure to support communities in making that transition. If we want older adults to be using telehealth, they have to have a broadband connection. They have to have a device that they can use, and they have to have the digital skills to know how to use it. If
Yeah.
we really want to get the most out of the economic opportunity potential from AI, we have to have a country where everybody has the basic digital skills and the basic access opportunities to deploy those skills to get the most out of it. We would be selling the opportunity short for anything less than that. And I worry that if we try to moonshot past all of those things, that we're leaving the door open for political disruption. That's not going to serve, I don't think, anyone in the end. As far as as sort of like national progress goes, if we just leave it to that. And so I think that it would be a misfortune, I think, if we just sort of closed our eyes, covered our ears, and just hope that everybody got it and was okay with it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I'm under impressed so far with how little AI is being considered for social innovation and social impact work. It's happening at the individual practitioner level. I think actually, the nonprofit space gets a lot of criticism for being slow to adopt technology, but I'm actually seeing, and I think there's some data to support that nonprofits are actually adopting AI more quickly than the private sector at large. Which has its pros and cons, I would say. But to your point, yeah, like we're talking about this new transformative technology when a certain percentage of our population right here in America still doesn't even have access to the internet in a meaningful way, or the skills to use it effectively. And I grew up as the internet was growing up. I had access to the internet very early. I was lucky in certain ways, lucky for that, in other ways maybe not so lucky. And I worry that the internet has actually been, in certain ways, a net negative on society, especially when you see the polarization and how much just like hate and disagreement there is in our country right now. And I don't think the internet is solely responsible for that, but I think it is a big part of that equation. And my fear is that will we see something similar happen with AI, where it just creates an even bigger digital divide, even bigger divides in terms of like class and wealth in America, where the most privileged and the wealthy of us are able to have even more leverage because of AI, and the people who are most at need or need more help or lack those resources, there's this technology that in theory could help them move up in life, but instead is going to just hold them down. I don't know. I mean, there's just so much that's going on with it. I don't think anyone knows, but your story is poignant around like these data centers that are using resources, water, electricity, et cetera, are being built in these communities where a good portion of people don't even have access to last generation's technological innovation. And so big issue, big thorny issue, not here to be an AI hater whatsoever. I think it has a lot of transformative potential. We use it all the time in constructive ways, even in our work today. But I do think this is a place where social innovation should be getting more attention than it is. And I hope that leaders in our space can start to make a case for that and participate in it, and that the AI providers do a better job of ensuring we're not just looking at how we can code things faster, but also how we can apply this technology to some of the things that we were promised early on in this vision that they painted around, medicine and health, and even like universal basic income was this thing that was talked about really early and doesn't seem to be talked about nearly as much as part of the AI disruption story.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. I mean, I'm in a lot of conversations where each one of those points gets brought up, and
Yeah.
I still struggle with, the just the reality that I see on the ground, which is, I'm plugged into this sort of national community that's talking about this very futurist vision of AI, but people around me are really just focused on this square box that's being built in the middle of a cornfield, and those are just such divergent, situations and realities. And I feel like as a country, we're in a position to really, to hopefully try to merge those two divergent realities, to bring people along with this opportunity, and ensure that I think we only get the most out of it when we have people participating, and have sort of the capability and agency to participate. And so I still, I remain just hopeful that's the direction we ultimately go as a national community, is that we are able to sort of merge those divergences, and ensure that this is something that is about widespread impact, right? I mean, I think scale is like the main distinguisher for AI, is like how fast it's grown, how quickly it is spread. And so there's really no reason that it shouldn't bring people along. It shouldn't leave people behind, versus like digital infrastructure of yesteryear, which was, fiber and broadband infrastructure does take longer to spread, and more investment and work to build. This is something that spreads much more rapidly. So we need to be doing a better job of equipping people and communities to ensure that they can positively benefit from it.
So before we wrap up, I want to ask one other thing, which is that you, as a leader, and I think all leaders can relate to this in one way or another, sometimes it's a grind. Sometimes the work is hard. Sometimes it's difficult, especially when we're, trying to grapple with these existential technologies or major cultural shifts that are happening, or even just like get through a community meeting when we're really trying to do our best job to listen. What in your life keeps you energized about this work, keeps you going, helps you wake up every day and not burn out when especially things get tough?
I mean, I think for me, I try to be present in these moments. I try not to dwell too much on the past or feel too overwhelmed about the future. To remain sort of grounded in the present, and recognize that for as much as we read articles and studies and information and listen to podcasts, that they're just signals, right? It's not a tablet coming down from on high that's telling us what the future is. And I still believe that the future is unwritten, and that we are the authors of that story. And so, I think what keeps me going through the grind and being hopeful, I love hearing what our individual service members are doing across the country. Where they're not the ones that are on podcasts being spotlighted often, but they're the ones that are sitting with that older adult, showing them how to use telehealth technology. They're sitting with a group of folks from the community, going through AI images and quizzing them on what's real and what's not real. Those little things that are going to be critical for us to bring people along. That's the work that gives me goosebumps. And whatever I can do to provide the resources or the means, the mission framing that enables that work to happen, like that's what motivates me. Is that I think that the future is largely unwritten. They're the ones that are writing it in community, and I'm just here to support them.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on today. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me. This is great.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Appreciate you having me on.
If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe, or even leave us a comment. It really helps. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do for your cause and for being part of the movement to move humanity and the planet forward.